Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The county records of St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, contain a peculiar gap. Between April and September of 1839, several pages appear to have been deliberately removed from the official ledgers. What remains are fragmented entries, notes about property transfers, birth records, and a series of unusual night patrols ordered by the local magistrate. The missing pages coincide precisely with what local historians would later refer to as the Summer of Whispers. According to what remains of these documents, the Bellamy Plantation, situated 17 miles northeast of Opelousas, was one of the largest sugar operations in the region. The plantation house still stands today, though no one has lived there since 1865. Local real estate records show that the property has changed hands 14 times since then, but curiously, no owner has occupied it for more than 7 months. The last attempted renovation was abandoned in 1958. In 1839, the plantation was home to approximately 143 enslaved individuals, though this number appears inconsistently in various records. The plantation's owner, Edmund Bellamy, was known throughout the parish as a man of considerable influence, a widower who had inherited not only the plantation, but substantial political connections throughout Louisiana. His name appears frequently in parish council minutes, particularly regarding expansion of his holdings and proposals for stricter county-wide patrol regulations. What happened on the night of June 14, 1839, would never be officially documented in the parish records. However, 3 separate sources provide fragmented accounts of the events. A private letter from Edmund Bellamy to his brother in Charleston, dated June 16th, a series of entries in the journal of local physician Dr. William Hargrove, and most notably, the partial transcript of a deposition given by Emmeline Fletcher, a housekeeper who had been employed at the neighboring Richardson estate. The commonly accepted narrative, pieced together from these sources and local oral histories, begins with what appeared to be an ordinary summer evening on the Bellamy plantation. The air was reportedly thick with humidity, as is common in Louisiana summers. According to Dr. Hargrove's journal, there had been no rain for nearly 3 weeks, and the ground had developed deep cracks from the persistent heat. That evening, Edmund Bellamy hosted a dinner for several prominent planters from the surrounding area. The occasion, according to his letter, was to discuss the establishment of a new cotton gin that would serve multiple plantations in the region. Among the guests were Harrison Richardson, James Monroe Prudhomme, and Thomas Whitfield, all names that appear repeatedly in St. Landry Parish records as substantial property owners. What no one at the dinner table appeared to notice was the unusual silence that had settled over the slave quarters that evening. Normally, according to Emmeline Fletcher's later deposition, there would be the sound of voices, sometimes low singing, that could be heard from the nearby Richardson property. But on that particular night, Fletcher noted that there wasn't a sound to be heard from that direction, not even the dogs. Meanwhile, according to the fragmented parish records, one Isaiah Morgan, a local carpenter who'd been hired to build additional storage buildings on the Bellamy property, was making his way back to Opelousas after completing his work for the day. His signed statement, recorded 3 days later, indicated that he had noticed something unusual as he passed the north field. Not a single night watchman to be seen, which struck me as peculiar given Mr. Bellamy's known insistence on security. The dinner, according to Bellamy's letter, proceeded without incident until approximately 9 o'clock, when one of the house servants, a woman whose name was recorded only as Martha, entered the dining room in obvious distress. What exactly she communicated to Bellamy is not recorded, but the immediate reaction suggests it was alarming enough to cause the dinner to be abruptly concluded. What happened in the following hours would be pieced together decades later by historians and folklorists, primarily from oral accounts passed down through generations, as no contemporary written record provides a complete timeline. These oral histories, collected by Louisiana State University researchers in 1952, suggest that the night's events centered around an enslaved man known only as Solomon. Solomon's exact age and origins are disputed across different accounts. In some versions of the story, he had been born on the Bellamy plantation. In others, he had been purchased from a plantation in Virginia approximately 5 years earlier. What appears consistent across all accounts is that Solomon was regarded with a mixture of respect and unease by both the enslaved community and the white plantation staff. According to Dr. Hargrove's journal, Solomon was uncommonly tall, with a severity of countenance that discouraged casual approach. The journal further notes that Solomon had once been tasked with overseeing other enslaved workers in the sugar mill, an unusual position of authority that was revoked after an incident that Hargrove describes only as the matter of the missing ledger. What is clear is that on the night of June 14th, Solomon was not in his assigned quarters. The parish night patrol, which typically submitted weekly reports, has a conspicuous gap in their records between June 12th and June 20th. When the reports resume, there is no mention of the Bellamy plantation at all, despite its prominent position in previous reports. Edmund Bellamy's letter to his brother contains a passage that historians have interpreted as deliberately vague. A situation has developed with one of the field hands which necessitates immediate action. I have engaged additional men for security purposes and have suspended regular operations until matters are resolved. I advise discretion in discussing this with our associates. The letter continues with a request for his brother to make discreet inquiries regarding steamboat passages to Cuba, and ends with a curious postscript. Burn this letter upon reading. Emmeline Fletcher's deposition, taken on June 17th by the parish sheriff, provides the most detailed contemporary account of the night's events. According to Fletcher, she had been awakened shortly after midnight by a commotion unlike anything I had ever heard, not shouting exactly, but a kind of collective movement, like many people moving with purpose. She described looking out her window toward the Bellamy plantation and seeing torches moving in formation, not scattered as would be the case in a typical search, but organized, as if following a plan. Fletcher's account continues with a detail that parish officials later struck from the official record, but which was preserved in the personal papers of Sheriff James Wilkinson, discovered in 1947. The torches numbered at least 30, possibly more, and they moved from the slave quarters toward the main house in a pattern that reminded me of a military exercise I had once witnessed in New Orleans. At this point, Fletcher's account becomes fragmented, with several portions of the deposition marked as irrelevant or witness confused. What remains suggests that she observed multiple fires being lit around the plantation's perimeter, creating what she described as a ring of light that seemed designed not to illuminate, but to contain. Dr. Hargrove's journal entry for June 15th contains this cryptic observation: called to the Bellamy plantation at approximately 3 o'clock this morning, found conditions chaotic, multiple injuries, none life-threatening, EB particularly agitated, insisting on private consultation. The man S nowhere to be found. Overheard reference to the gathering. Parish officials arrived as I was leaving. A notice appeared in the Opelousas Courier on June 22nd, offering a reward of $500 for information leading to the apprehension of a runaway slave, male, answering to the name of Solomon, approximately 35 years of age, 6 feet 2 inches in height, with a scar above his right eye. The notice was unusual in its specificity about the man's literacy. Known to read and write, and may attempt to pass correspondence. By July, similar notices had appeared in newspapers as far away as Natchitoches and New Orleans, with the reward increased to $1,000. EB requested discretion. In the weeks that followed, there are scattered references in various documents to an extensive search conducted throughout St. Landry Parish and beyond. By August, the notices had stopped entirely. What makes this case particularly unusual is not just the apparent coordination of events on the night of June 14th, but the complete absence of any conclusive resolution in the historical record. No document ever confirms the capture or fate of Solomon. The Bellamy plantation ledgers, which had previously been meticulously maintained, show a curious gap between June and September of 1839, after which they resume with notations indicating a significant reduction in the plantation's workforce and productivity. Edmund Bellamy himself appears to have left St. Landry Parish by the end of 1839. A property transfer document dated December 3rd indicates that he sold the plantation to his brother-in-law, Richard Devereux, for a sum considerably below market value. Parish tax records indicate that Bellamy relocated to Cuba sometime in early 1840, where he established a much smaller sugar operation. In 1852, a Methodist minister named Reverend Jonathan Sawyer recorded in his journal a conversation with an elderly man in a small settlement outside Baton Rouge. The man, whose name Sawyer did not record, claimed to have worked on the Bellamy plantation during the time of the uprising. Sawyer's journal contains this account. The old man spoke of how they had planned it for months, communicating through a system of coded work songs and messages hidden in the everyday. He described how the man they called the prophet had taught them to move silently, to coordinate their actions through signals rather than words. We didn't need to speak, he told me. We had become like a single body with many parts, each knowing its purpose. Reverend Sawyer's journal entry concludes with a disturbing detail. When I asked about the fate of this prophet, the old man smiled in a manner I found unsettling and said only, "Some say he went north. But those who know, they understand he went exactly where he intended." The mystery deepened in 1868, 3 years after the Civil War ended, when a former Confederate officer named Colonel Thomas Blackwood published a memoir entitled Reflections on the Late Conflict. In a chapter dealing with slave unrest during the antebellum period, Blackwood included this passage. The most troubling incident, which was deliberately suppressed in public records but was well known, among those responsible for maintaining order, occurred in St. Others say he went further south, Landry Parish, in the summer of 1839. What made this case unique was not merely the scale of the coordination, which involved multiple plantations, but the sophistication of its execution. The leader, a man known only as Solomon, had apparently spent years creating a network of communication and trust that extended far beyond a single plantation. When the actual uprising occurred, it was remarkable not for its violence. Indeed, there were surprisingly few casualties, but for its precision. Most disturbing was the discovery, made too late, that detailed maps of the parish patrol routes, schedules of steamboat arrivals and departures, and even notes on the habits of prominent planters had been meticulously compiled and shared among the conspirators. Blackwood's account continues. The aftermath was handled with uncharacteristic discretion by local authorities, primarily due to the fear that knowledge of such a well-organized effort might inspire similar actions elsewhere. The official record was sanitized to suggest a simple case of a single runaway slave, while the true scope of the network he had created was known only to a few. It is my understanding that at least 28 individuals escaped that night, using routes that had been carefully planned over many months, perhaps years. In 1871, a journalist from the New York Tribune named Frederick Morton traveled to Louisiana to document the experiences of formerly enslaved people in the post-war South. Among his notes preserved in the Tribune's archives is an interview with a woman identified only as Rebecca, age approximately 65, who claimed to have been enslaved on the Richardson plantation adjacent to the Bellamy property. According to Morton's notes, Rebecca described Solomon as a man who spoke little but saw everything. She told Morton he wasn't like the others. He could read the white folks' books. He knew their ways. He'd been planning for years, watching how they moved, when they slept, what made them careless. He taught us patience. The right moment will announce itself, he used to say. When Morton asked about the events of June 1839, Rebecca reportedly became reluctant to provide details, saying only, "There are things still dangerous to speak of, even now." She did, however, offer this cryptic statement. Solomon always said that freedom wasn't just about running away. It was about understanding that the masters were not gods. They were just men who slept, who made mistakes, who could be studied and known. Once you truly understood that, he said, you were already partly free. The last significant historical reference to the events at the Bellamy plantation comes from a collection of letters discovered in 1948 during the renovation of an old house in Philadelphia. The letters, dated between 1840 and 1845, were written by a Quaker abolitionist named Elijah Pennington to various correspondents involved in the Underground Railroad. In one letter dated October 1842, Pennington wrote, "I have recently had the extraordinary experience of meeting the man from Louisiana about whom so many rumors have circulated. I found him to be neither the violent revolutionary that Southern planters have described, nor the mythic figure celebrated in certain abolitionist circles. He is, rather, a man of remarkable intellect and discipline who approaches the great moral question of our time with the precision of a military strategist and the patience of a natural philosopher. What he accomplished in St. Landry Parish was, he assured me, merely a preliminary demonstration of what is possible when fear is methodically replaced with organization." Pennington's letter continues, "Most striking to me was his insistence that the greatest weapon in the enslaved person's arsenal is not physical resistance, which he considers ultimately futile against superior armaments, but rather the plantation owner's inability to conceive of slaves as capable of complex, long-term planning. They believe us to be creatures of impulse," and he told me, "and this blindness is the gap through which we will eventually lead thousands to freedom." The letter concludes with a detail that historians have debated ever since. He has now gone to Canada, where he intends to establish a school. Its purpose, he says, is not merely literacy, but instruction in what he calls the architecture of liberation, a systematic approach to understanding and ultimately dismantling the institutions of bondage. I confess that listening to him outline his methods filled me with both hope and trepidation, for they are so coldly rational as to be almost terrifying in their implications. After this letter, the historical record falls silent on Solomon's fate. No further documentation of his activities has ever been discovered, despite extensive research by historians specializing in the Underground Railroad and slave resistance movements. What makes the case of the Bellamy plantation particularly notable in the annals of American history is not merely what happened, but how deliberately it was obscured. The systematic removal of documents, the pressure applied to witnesses to modify their accounts, and the creation of a simplified official narrative all suggest a level of concern among authorities that went beyond the typical response to slave unrest. The most unsettling aspect of the case, from the perspective of those who sought to suppress it, appears to have been the recognition that Solomon represented something they had long refused to acknowledge: the capacity for enslaved people to observe, analyze, and ultimately exploit the vulnerabilities of the system that oppressed them. In 1958, during the abandoned renovation of the Bellamy plantation house, workers discovered a small metal box concealed within a wall cavity. The box contained a single document, a hand-drawn map of St. Landry Parish, with annotations in a precise, educated hand. The map showed not only roads and waterways, but also detailed notations about patrol schedules, safe houses, and observation points. In the margin, written in what appears to be the same hand, was this inscription: "To know the terrain is to begin to own it." The map was donated to the Louisiana State Museum in 1959, where it remained largely forgotten until 1967, when historian Dr. Margaret Wilkins included it in her groundbreaking study of slave resistance movements. Wilkins noted that the map's precision and detail suggested a level of planning that contradicted prevailing historical narratives about the spontaneous and disorganized nature of slave resistance. Local oral traditions in St. Landry Parish have preserved additional details about Solomon that never entered the official record. According to stories collected by folklorists in the 1950s, Solomon had developed a system of communication using work songs whose lyrics changed subtly to convey messages across the plantation. Other accounts suggest he had created a method for temporary map-making, using arrangements of stones and sticks that could be easily dispersed if discovered. Perhaps most intriguing are the persistent local beliefs about Solomon's ultimate fate. While some accounts claim he successfully escaped to Canada, others insist that he never actually left Louisiana at all. According to these traditions, he remained hidden in the bayous, continuing to organize and facilitate escapes for years. One particularly enduring story suggests that he established a settlement deep in the Atchafalaya Basin that served as a way station for those seeking freedom. No archaeological evidence has ever confirmed the existence of such a settlement, though several expeditions attempted to locate it in the 1960s. The most recent scholarly examination of the Bellamy plantation case was conducted by Dr. James Washington of Howard University in 1968. After exhaustive research in archives throughout the United States and Canada, Washington concluded, "The case of Solomon and the Bellamy plantation represents one of the most sophisticated examples of resistance to slavery ever documented in the American South." What distinguishes this case is not just the careful planning and coordination involved, but the deliberate effort to ensure that even the memory of these events would be controlled and shaped by those who participated in them, rather than by those who sought to suppress them. In this sense, Solomon's most remarkable achievement may have been creating a narrative that continued to resist authority even decades after the events themselves. Dr. Washington's research also uncovered a final, tantalizing detail. In the archives of a small black church in Ontario, he discovered a collection of educational materials dated 1852. Among them was a slim, handwritten text entitled "Principles of Strategic Observation," attributed only to S. The text outlined methods for analyzing power structures, identifying vulnerabilities in systems of control, and organizing collective action based on shared knowledge rather than individual heroism. The final page of the text contained this passage: "Remember always that true freedom begins in the mind. Before the body can be free, the mind must first understand the nature of the chains that bind it. Study your oppressor as carefully as the naturalist studies the habits of birds or the movements of stars. Record what you observe. Share what you learn. Create networks of knowledge that cannot be broken even when individuals are lost. And remember that the most powerful weapon in your arsenal is the oppressor's certainty that you are incapable of doing exactly this. The Bellamy plantation house still stands today, though it has been unoccupied for over a century and a half. Local residents avoid the property, particularly after dark. Some claim to have heard sounds of movement around the old slave quarters on summer nights. Not voices or footsteps, but something more organized, like many people moving with purpose. In 1963, a historian attempting to document the condition of the property reported an unusual discovery. On the back wall of what had once been the overseer's quarters, barely visible beneath layers of peeling paint, was a carefully inscribed message. The handwriting matched that found on the map discovered in 1958. The message read simply, "We are always watching." No one knows who wrote those words or when. But for generations, the story of Solomon and the summer of 1839 has been passed down in St. Landry Parish, not as a tale of supernatural horror, but as something perhaps more unsettling, a reminder that power, no matter how absolute it appears, is always vulnerable to those who learn to observe its patterns with patience and precision. To this day, on June 14th, some local residents report seeing lights moving in formation across the abandoned fields of the former Bellamy plantation. Others dismiss these sightings as mere folklore. But local historians note an interesting pattern. Despite numerous development proposals over the decades, the land has never been successfully repurposed. Construction equipment malfunctions. Workers refuse to return after their first day. Investors withdraw without explanation. The last serious attempt to develop the property occurred in 1966. The project was abandoned after the lead architect reported finding the same message, "We are always watching," scratched into the dust on his drafting table each morning, despite the building being securely locked overnight. Is it possible that Solomon's legacy continues to protect the land that witnessed his most significant achievement? Or is the persistence of his memory simply a testament to the power of a story that challenges our understanding of resistance and agency in American history? What we know with certainty is that somewhere in the summer of 1839, in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, a man named Solomon fundamentally altered the narrative of slave resistance, not through violence or martyrdom, but through the patient application of intelligence, observation, and strategic thinking. And in doing so, he created a mystery that has resisted resolution for more than a century. The parish records remain incomplete. The gaps in the narrative persist. And on certain summer nights, locals say, if you stand at the edge of what was once the Bellamy plantation, you might hear what sounds like people moving with purpose through the darkness, not in fear or chaos, but with the quiet confidence of those who have studied the terrain and know exactly where they are going. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Bellamy plantation case is how it challenges our understanding of resistance. Unlike other documented slave revolts, which were often characterized by their violence and immediate, if temporary, impact, Solomon's approach represented something far more subtle and arguably more threatening to the institution of slavery itself. He demonstrated that the system could be observed, studied, and ultimately manipulated by those it sought to control. In 1961, the descendants of Thomas Whitfield, one of the planters present at the Bellamy dinner on the night of June 14th, donated a collection of family papers to Tulane University. Among these papers was a letter dated July 2nd, 1839, addressed to Whitfield's brother in Virginia. The letter contains this revealing passage: "The most alarming aspect of the recent incident is not what occurred, but what it implies. The man orchestrated not merely an escape, but what can only be described as a military operation, with coordinated movements, diversionary tactics, and a chain of command that functioned with disturbing efficiency. Most troubling is the realization that this level of organization must have developed over years, entirely beneath our notice. One cannot help but wonder what else might be transpiring that we have failed to observe. This sentiment, the sudden, disorienting recognition that an entire world of planning and purpose could exist within a system designed specifically to prevent such agency, appears to have been the true source of the terror that spread through the planter community in the wake of the incident. It was not the fear of violence that prompted the deliberate obscuring of records and the sanitization of the official narrative, but rather the fear of an idea that the enslaved were not merely capable of resistance, but of a kind of resistance that revealed the fundamental vulnerability of the entire institution. In 1878, Harriet Wilson, a formerly enslaved woman who had worked in the Bellamy household, gave an interview to a northern journalist in which she described Solomon's methods. He taught us to see differently, to look at the master's house, not as this great, powerful thing that ruled our lives, but as a collection of habits and patterns. He'd say, "Watch how they move, watch when they're most alert and when they're distracted. Watch what they forget to secure and what they guard most carefully. Everything you need to know about their fears is visible in what they protect." Wilson's account continues. He kept a kind of inventory in his head. He knew every lock and key on that plantation, knew which overseers drank too much on which nights, knew exactly how long it took the parish patrol to make their rounds. But most important, he knew people, knew who could be trusted, who had skills that might be useful, who had family on other plantations that could extend the network. He built it all so carefully that even those of us who were part of it didn't know its full extent. That way, if someone was caught, they couldn't reveal what they didn't know. This methodical approach appears to have extended to the uprising itself. Unlike other slave rebellions, which often resulted in significant bloodshed, the Bellamy plantation incident was remarkably restrained in its violence. According to Dr. Hargrove's medical records, the injuries he treated on the night of June 14th consisted primarily of contusions and minor lacerations, consistent with restraint rather than attack. This strategic restraint, historians now believe, was a deliberate choice rather than a limitation, a recognition that excessive violence would trigger a level of response that would endanger the broader network. In 1892, a journalist named Edward Palmer traveled to St. Landry Parish to research a book on Louisiana folklore. During his stay, he interviewed an elderly man named Robert Johnson, who claimed to be the son of one of the men who escaped from the Bellamy plantation. According to Palmer's notes, Johnson shared a story his father had told him about Solomon's instructions on the night of the uprising. "My father," said Solomon, "gathered them all just before it began and told them, 'Remember, our victory is not in harming them, but in leaving them. Not in destroying property, but in claiming our own lives as property that cannot be owned. Strike only when necessary, and then only enough to clear your path. Our goal is not vengeance, but liberation.' If this account is accurate, it represents a remarkable level of discipline and strategic thinking. Solomon appears to have understood that the success of his plan depended not on inflicting maximum damage, but on minimizing the response that would follow. By limiting violence and property destruction, he ensured that the subsequent manhunt would be conducted with less urgency and fewer resources than might otherwise have been deployed. This calculated approach extended to the timing of the uprising. June 14, 1839, was not chosen arbitrarily. Parish records indicate that the date coincided with a scheduled meeting of prominent planters in New Orleans, which had drawn away several members of the local militia who would normally have been available to respond to such an incident. Additionally, shipping records show that a steamboat bound for Cincinnati was scheduled to depart from a landing approximately 17 miles from the Bellamy plantation on the morning of June 15th, a detail that suggests careful coordination with potential escape routes. The question of exactly how many people escaped during the uprising remains unresolved. The official record, as reflected in newspaper notices and correspondence between parish officials, indicates that only Solomon and perhaps 2 or 3 others successfully fled. However, census records and plantation ledgers tell a different story. The Bellamy plantation's workforce decreased by 27 people between the May and September inventories of 1839. The neighboring Richardson plantation shows a decrease of 11. These numbers, while not conclusive, suggest a much larger operation than was ever publicly acknowledged. In 1957, an archaeological excavation at the site of the former Bellamy plantation uncovered another piece of the puzzle. Beneath the remains of one of the slave cabins, researchers discovered a small cavity containing 3 objects: a hand-carved wooden box containing a collection of carefully folded paper scraps, each bearing single words or phrases in a precise hand, a crude but detailed map of the surrounding parishes, and most intriguingly, a small journal bound in leather. The journal, dated between 1836 and 1839, appears to have been kept by Solomon himself, though he never identifies himself by name in its pages. Written in a sophisticated, educated hand, the journal contains not personal reflections, but rather a systematic record of observations about the plantation's operations. Entries detail the movement patterns of overseers, the schedules of parish patrols, the habits of the Bellamy household, and even the response times for neighboring plantations to come to each other's aid during previous emergencies. One entry, dated April 3, 1839, reads, "Final route confirmed. Timing tests complete. Primary and secondary signals established. Decision point set for early June, dependent on river levels and boat schedules. Network fully mapped and responsibilities assigned. Reserve positions identified in case of primary failures." Another entry, the last in the journal, dated June 12, 1839, contains just 3 words: "Tomorrow we begin." The journal represents one of the most significant primary sources on slave resistance ever discovered, not least because it reveals the extraordinary level of planning involved. More than 3 years of careful observation, testing, and preparation preceded the actual uprising, a time frame that helps explain its ultimate success. Perhaps most remarkable is what the journal does not contain. There are no expressions of anger, no calls for vengeance, no emotional language of any kind. It is a document of pure strategy, cold, methodical, and focused entirely on the practical challenges of orchestrating a mass escape from one of the most tightly controlled environments imaginable. This absence of emotional content has led some historians to question whether Solomon's leadership was inspired by moral outrage at the institution of slavery or merely by a desire for personal freedom. But such speculation may miss the point. As Dr. Washington noted in his 1968 study, the journal's clinical tone may itself have been a strategic choice, a deliberate separation of emotion from action that allowed for clear thinking in an environment where emotional reactions could be fatal. To read this document as lacking moral purpose is to misunderstand the context in which it was created. Sometimes, survival itself is the most profound moral statement possible. In 1959, a remarkable discovery was made in the archives of Wilberforce University in Ohio. Among a collection of documents related to the Underground Railroad was a letter dated February 1842, signed simply S. The handwriting matches that found in the journal discovered at the Bellamy plantation. The letter, addressed to a known abolitionist, contains this passage: "You ask what principles guided our action. I would answer thus. First, that knowledge precedes freedom. Not merely the knowledge found in books, though that has its value, but the patient observation of systems and their weaknesses. Second, that collective action requires trust, but also compartmentalization, each person knowing their role, but not necessarily the entire design. Third, that timing is more crucial than force. The right moment with minimal action will accomplish what great violence at the wrong moment cannot. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, that the mind must be freed before the body can follow. Many remained in physical bondage long after they had begun to see the plantation not as an immutable reality, but as a flawed system that could be studied, understood, and ultimately defeated. This philosophical framework represents a sophisticated approach to resistance that goes far beyond simple escape or rebellion. It suggests that Solomon's ultimate goal was not merely to free himself and others from a particular plantation, but to develop and disseminate a methodology of liberation that could be applied in multiple contexts. Evidence suggests that he may have succeeded in this broader aim. Between 1840 and 1855, plantation records throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, and eastern Texas show a marked increase in successful escapes that followed similar patterns: minimal violence, coordinated timing, and carefully planned routes. While no direct connection to Solomon has ever been established, the similarities in method are striking. In 1960, historian Dr. The letters express growing concern about what one writer described as a new and disturbing methodology of subversion that appears to be spreading among the slave population. Another writer observed, "It is not the familiar pattern of impulsive flight or violent uprising, but something more insidious, a patient, observant approach that exploits weaknesses in our systems that we ourselves had not recognized." These concerns eventually prompted changes in plantation management throughout the region. Eleanor Thompson uncovered a series of letters exchanged between plantation owners in the Deep South between 1842 and 1845. Patrol schedules were made more irregular, communication between enslaved people from different plantations was more strictly controlled, and greater attention was paid to any signs of unusual behavior or organization. That these measures were deemed necessary suggests that Solomon's approach had indeed created a new kind of threat, one that could not be easily countered because it operated within the blind spots of the system itself. The full extent of Solomon's influence may never be known with certainty. The deliberate destruction and alteration of records, combined with the inherently covert nature of his methods, has ensured that much of his story remains in shadow. But the fragments that survive paint a portrait of a man who understood that the most effective resistance might not be the most visible. That real change often begins not with dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet accumulation of knowledge and the patient identification of opportunity. In October 1964, construction workers renovating an old building in Philadelphia that had once been a station on the Underground Railroad discovered a hidden compartment containing several documents. Among them was a single page of what appeared to be teaching notes, dated 1847, written in the same hand identified as Solomon's. The notes outlined a lesson plan for teaching newly escaped enslaved people how to survive in freedom. One passage reads, "Begin by helping them understand that freedom is not merely the absence of a master, but the presence of self-determination. Many will have been trained since birth to believe themselves incapable of such determination. The first and most crucial lesson, therefore, is to demonstrate that they have always possessed capabilities that the system of bondage sought to suppress or exploit. Remind them of the skills they developed, the knowledge they accumulated, the strategies they employed to survive. Help them see that these same abilities, redirected toward their own benefit rather than that of a master, form the foundation of a free existence. The notes continue with practical advice on establishing new identities, finding work, managing money, and navigating unfamiliar social systems. But they also contain this philosophical reflection. The greatest challenge for one newly freed is not the practical matters of survival, though these are considerable, but rather the mental transition from being property to being a person. This transformation requires unlearning deeply ingrained patterns of thought and behavior. It requires recognizing that the voice of the master, with all its commands and prohibitions, has been internalized and must now be identified and silenced. True freedom begins when one can distinguish between this imposed voice and one's own authentic desires and judgments. This sophisticated understanding of the psychological dimensions of both oppression and liberation suggests that Solomon's approach went far beyond the immediate goal of physical escape. He appears to have recognized that sustainable freedom required a fundamental shift in consciousness, a recognition that would later be echoed in various liberation movements throughout history. The last confirmed reference to Solomon appears in the diary of a Canadian minister named Reverend Thomas Blackwell, who recorded meeting a remarkable Negro gentleman from the American South in Toronto in 1853. Blackwell described him as a man of uncommon intelligence and dignity, who speaks little of his own experiences, but much of his vision for the education and advancement of his people. The diary entry concludes, "Though he did not say so directly, I gathered from our conversation that he had himself been enslaved and had secured his freedom through extraordinary means. When I inquired about his past, he replied simply, 'My history is less important than the future I am working to create.' I was left with the impression of a man who has witnessed terrible things but has transformed his suffering into a kind of cold clarity of purpose that is simultaneously admirable and somewhat unsettling." After this entry, Solomon vanishes from the historical record entirely. Various unconfirmed reports place him in Canada, England, and even West Africa in the years that followed. But no definitive evidence of his later life or death has ever been discovered. This disappearance has contributed to the mythologizing of Solomon in both historical accounts and local folklore. In St. Landry Parish, stories persisted well into the 20th century that he had never truly left Louisiana, that he continued to move unseen through the region, facilitating escapes and building networks of resistance. Other accounts claimed that he had established a school in Canada where he taught his methods to others, who then returned south to continue his work. These legends speak to the powerful impact of Solomon's example, not as a conventional hero of violent resistance, but as a symbol of a different kind of opposition, patient, observant, strategic, and ultimately more difficult to defeat precisely because it operated within the blind spots of power. In 1968, on the wall of an abandoned building in New Orleans that had once housed a black mutual aid society, a team of architectural preservationists discovered a faded inscription. The handwriting matched that identified as Solomon's in other documents. It read simply, "Power is never absolute. It depends on blindness, the blindness of the powerful to their own vulnerabilities, and the blindness of the oppressed to their own strength. Remove either blindness, and the balance shifts." Whether Solomon himself wrote these words, or whether they were transcribed by someone who had encountered his teachings, remains unknown. But they encapsulate the essence of his approach. An approach that recognized that systems of control, no matter how thoroughly designed or brutally enforced, inevitably contain gaps and weaknesses that can be identified and exploited by those patient and observant enough to find them. This philosophy represents perhaps the most enduring and disturbing legacy of the Bellamy plantation incident. It suggests that true resistance begins not with confrontation, but with perception, with learning to see the structures of power not as monolithic and impenetrable, but as human creations filled with flaws and blind spots. And it implies that the most effective opposition might not announce itself at all, but might instead operate in the shadows, unseen and therefore uncounted, until the moment it has already succeeded. Today, the Bellamy plantation stands abandoned, its buildings slowly reclaimed by the Louisiana landscape. Local residents still avoid the property after dark, though few could articulate exactly why. Some claim to hear sounds on summer nights, not the theatrical moans or clanking chains of conventional ghost stories, but something more unsettling: the quiet, purposeful movement of people who know exactly where they are going and why. Perhaps the most fitting memorial to Solomon and what he accomplished is not a physical monument, but this persistent unease. This sense that beneath the surface of history, as it is commonly told, there exists another narrative, one of patient observation and strategic action, of freedom achieved not through permission or proclamation, but through the careful identification and exploitation of the blind spots of power. In the words attributed to Solomon himself in the Philadelphia Teaching Notes, "Remember always that your greatest weapon is not force but perception. Learn to see what others overlook. Learn to recognize patterns where others perceive only chaos. Learn to identify the moments when systems are vulnerable, and above all, learn to act with precision when those moments arrive." This is the true architecture of liberation. As the sun sets over the abandoned fields of the former Bellamy plantation, one cannot help but wonder, how many other Solomons have there been throughout history, operating unseen within the blind spots of power? And how many of the freedoms we now take for granted were secured not by those whose names we remember, but by those who understood that sometimes the most effective resistance leaves no trace at all? The mystery of Solomon, who he was, what became of him, and the full extent of what he accomplished, remains unresolved. But perhaps that unresolved quality is itself part of his legacy. In creating a narrative that resists complete understanding or easy categorization, he ensured that his story would continue to unsettle and provoke long after the physical traces of his existence had vanished. The last word on Solomon may belong to Dr. Margaret Wilkins, who concluded her 1967 study with this observation: "What makes the case of Solomon and the Bellamy plantation so significant is not merely what it reveals about the past, but what it suggests about the present and future. It reminds us that beneath the surface of any system of control, no matter how seemingly complete or inescapable, there may exist networks of resistance that operate according to entirely different principles, networks based not on confrontation or violence, but on patient observation, strategic thinking, and the identification of blind spots in the structures of power. And it suggests that such resistance, precisely because it does not announce itself, may be both more difficult to detect and ultimately more effective than more visible forms of opposition. As night falls over St. Landry Parish, and the abandoned buildings of the Bellamy plantation fade into darkness, one can almost imagine Solomon still watching, still calculating, still identifying the patterns and vulnerabilities that others fail to see. And in that imagining lies perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, that the most powerful resistance may be that which remains invisible until the moment it has already succeeded.